There was a time when the world had no memory. There was no history, no names, no kings carved in stone, no stories written in clay. Only sky, earth, and silence. Thousands of years before the pyramids, thousands of years before Rome, even before the Old Testament was imagined. In the heart of what we now call the Middle East, two rivers flowed down from distant mountains, the Tigris and the Euphrates. Unpredictable rivers, violent, capricious. They flooded without warning, swept everything away, and then left behind dark, fertile soil. Land that seemed dead, yet held life within it. For millennia, small human groups survived there. They hunted, they fished, they migrated, they fled from the rising waters, until one day, something changed. It was not a battle. It was not a divine miracle. It was a decision. Someone, we don't know who, chose not to leave when the rains came, chose to stay, chose to build. And that seemingly insignificant act transformed the destiny of humanity. Because when humans stopped wandering, they began to imagine. They imagined organized fields, canals that could tame the water, storehouses to preserve grain, walls to protect what was now theirs. And without knowing it, they were inventing the modern world. There, in that land of mud and raging rivers, something was born that had never existed before. The city. Not a village, not a temporary camp, a city, with temples that touched the sky, with priests who spoke in the name of invisible gods, with kings who claimed absolute power, with merchants, artisans, scribes, with laws, with memory, with ambition. That place had a name: Sumer, the first civilization in history, the first large-scale human experiment, the first attempt to organize chaos. Here, writing was invented. Here, the first maps of the heavens were drawn. Here, the first epic poems were written. Here, the very concept of empire was born. But here also emerged the first organized wars, inequality, propaganda, the obsession with immortality. Sumer was not just the beginning of civilization, it was the beginning of us. And like every great story, it did not end in eternal glory, because even the first cities in the world could fall. This is the story of how it all began, of how mud became monument, of how clay became word, of how humans learned to master rivers and then tried to master fate. Before Babylon, before the pharaohs, before Genesis, there was Sumer, and everything began between two rivers. The land did not seem destined for greatness. It was not Egypt with its tame and predictable river. It was not a peninsula protected by mountains. It was not a fertile valley surrounded by natural security. It was an open plain, vulnerable, exposed, an endless stretch of dry mud and a trembling horizon beneath the sun. And yet, that
is where the miracle happened. From the mountains of Anatolia descended two forces impossible to control, the Tigris and the Euphrates. They were not gentle rivers. They did not follow precise calendars. They did not promise stability. They flooded when they wished. They destroyed crops. They swept away entire villages. But when the waters receded, they left something extraordinary behind: dark silt, rich soil, potential life. For thousands of years, the human groups who lived in this region survived as best they could. They were early farmers, fishermen, shepherds. They knew the danger of the water, but they also sensed its power. Until someone understood something decisive. If the river will not obey, perhaps we can guide it. That was the true beginning of civilization. Not writing, not kings, not temples, canals. They dug trenches into the earth. They built rudimentary levees. They redirected the water toward carefully marked fields. It was a revolutionary act. For the first time, human beings were not merely reacting to nature, they were organizing it. And when the water began to flow where they chose, something even greater happened. Surplus. More grain than was necessary, more food than a single family could consume. And surplus changes the world, because when not everyone has to produce food, some can do something else. Some become artisans, others merchants, others priests. And so, without official proclamation, without an exact date, without ceremony, the first cities were born. At first, they were modest settlements, mud brick houses clustered around a simple temple. But year after year they grew. The most extraordinary of them was Uruk. Uruk was not just large, it was inconceivable for its time. Tens of thousands of people living together, monumental walls, temples raised on mud platforms, a complex social organization. For the first time in history, a human being could live surrounded by strangers. That changed everything. Identity no longer depended only on clan or family. Now it depended on the city. I am from Uruk. I am from I am from Lagash. The city became an almost sacred entity. At its center stood the temple, not only as a religious place, but as an economic and political heart. There grain was stored, there resources were distributed, there labor was organized. The priests did not only speak to the gods, they administered the world. But this new way of life carried invisible tensions. Cooperation had to be constant. The canal system required permanent maintenance. One mistake could mean famine. Civilization was fragile, and yet they kept growing. The Mesopotamian plain began to fill with urban centers connected by trade routes. They exchanged wood, metals, precious stones, resources that did not exist in their own territory. Sumer had almost nothing, no abundant stone, no significant metals, no dense forests. And precisely because of that, it became innovative. What they lacked in resources, they compensated with organization. What they lacked in natural security, they compensated with social structure.
What they lacked in climatic stability, they compensated with engineering. Civilization was not born in the most comfortable place on Earth. It was born in one of the most challenging. And perhaps that is why it became so powerful. Between the Tigris and the Euphrates, the human being ceased to be merely a survivor. He became a planner, an architect,
and administrator of time and space. There, between unpredictable rivers and infinite horizons, began the most ambitious experiment of our species: to live together, on a large scale, under shared rules. The awakening had begun, but when cities grow, so does the desire for power. And very soon on those fertile plains, the first kings would appear. Perfect. Now we enter the moment when civilization stops being an experiment and becomes a system.
At first, each city was a world unto itself. There was no Sumer as a nation, no central government, no shared flag. There were cities, and each one believed it stood at the center of the universe. Uruk claimed to be chosen by the gods. Ur proclaimed its sacred lineage. Eridu insisted it was the oldest of them all. Lagash defended its military strength. Each city had its protective deity. Each city had its main temple. Each city had its pride, and that pride was fuel. At the heart of them all rose a structure that dominated the landscape, the ziggurat. It was not simply a religious building, it was a declaration. An artificial mountain in a flat land, a bridge between heaven and humanity, a visible symbol of divine power and human power. From miles away, the ziggurat announced, "Here there is order, here there is wealth, here there is authority." But maintaining that order required something new: administration. Temples began recording incoming and outgoing grain. They counted livestock. They organized workers. And when human memory was no longer enough, they invented something revolutionary: writing. At first, there were no poems or laws. There were accounts. Numbers pressed into wet clay with a wooden stylus. Small marks representing quantities. But those marks carried immense power. For the first time, information could outlive the person who created it. Memory no longer depended on the body. Now it could be stored. And when memory can be stored, power consolidates. Scribes became an elite. They were few, they were trained, they were indispensable. Not everyone could read those wedge-shaped signs. Whoever mastered writing mastered the system. Meanwhile, the cities continued to grow. Streets narrowed, houses multiplied, markets buzzed with activity. There were bakers, potters, metalworkers, weavers. Trade stretched beyond the horizon. Sumer lacked sufficient stone and metal, so it traded with distant regions: Anatolia, the Persian Gulf, even the Indus Valley. Caravans crossed deserts. Boats navigated rivers and seas. For the first time, the world was beginning to connect. But where there is wealth, there is tension. Water was still limited. Canals crossed disputed territories. Harvests were not always abundant. And when one city controlled more water than another, rivalry was inevitable. The first walls were raised not against nature, but against other humans. The first organized wars were not fought over ideology. They were fought over resources, over fertile fields, over access to the river, over prestige. Civilization, born from cooperation, was now beginning to test conflict. And in that context, a new figure emerged: the king. At first, temples ruled, but in times of crisis, floods, famine, war, cities needed more direct leaders, men who commanded armies, who made swift decisions, who imposed order. Some were chosen temporarily. Others decided that power should not be returned. Thus, kingship was born. The Sumerian title was Lugal, literally, great man. But soon that great man began to say something more. I do not rule by force alone. I rule because the gods chose me. Military power fused with divine legitimacy, and that combination would change history forever. Cities were no longer merely economic and religious centers. They were states. States that competed, that negotiated, that fought. Sumer became a dynamic, vibrant, dangerous chessboard of power. And among all those cities, one would rise above the rest.
Uruk, the city that would reach dimensions never before seen. The city that would raise legendary walls. The city whose king would become myth. For in the heart of that massive urban world ruled a man who was not satisfied with power. He wanted something more. He wanted to transcend. And his name would be remembered for millennia. Gilgamesh.
In the ancient world, kings were power, but Gilgamesh was something else. His name did not survive only in lists of dynasties. It was not trapped in a forgotten inscription. Gilgamesh crossed a boundary that almost no human ever crosses. He became history, and then myth. The texts say he was 2/3 divine and 1/3 human. An impossible proportion, a warning, because if a man has the strength of a god, he may also have the arrogance of a god. Uruk prospered. Its walls rose higher, its temple shone with offerings. But within that greatness, something was rotting. Gilgamesh ruled like a storm. He demanded labor, he demanded tribute, he demanded obedience, and the city, exhausted, raised a single prayer. Let someone stop him. In Sumerian tales, the gods listen, but the gods do not correct with sermons. They correct by creating equal forces. And so, from clay and from the wild, a man was born destined to confront him, Enkidu. He was not raised in a palace. He learned no rules, no titles. He grew among animals. He drank water beside the beasts. He lived as if civilization did not exist. He was pure nature. And when Enkidu arrived in Uruk, the city saw something it had never seen before, someone who did not fear the king. The clash was inevitable. Two opposing forces, two worlds. And when they fought, the ground trembled, doors groaned, walls shook, but neither fell. And in that instant, something strange happened. Hatred turned into respect, and respect into friendship. The first great friendship recorded in human history. For the first time, Gilgamesh found an equal. For the first time, Enkidu found a purpose. And as often happens with young men who believe themselves invincible, they decided to challenge the world. Glory was not enough. Uruk was not enough. The throne was not enough. Gilgamesh wanted his name to echo beyond time. So he chose an enemy that seemed invincible, the cedar forest, a distant, sacred place guarded by a monstrous being, Humbaba. To go to the cedar forest was not merely an expedition, it was sacrilege, because in the Sumerian mind, the wild was divine territory. To cut those trees was to steal something from the gods. But Gilgamesh did not hesitate, and Enkidu followed him.
They crossed hostile lands. They slept beneath unprotected skies. They listened to omens in their dreams. And finally, they arrived. The forest seemed to breathe. The cedars rose like columns of a living temple. And there stood Humbaba, a guardian designed to inspire terror. The battle was brutal, and yet they won. They cut the cedars, they claimed the glory, they returned to Uruk as heroes. But when a human challenges the sacred, the world responds. In the texts, the goddess Inanna, Ishtar, sets her eyes on Gilgamesh. She desires him. She offers him power. She offers him prestige. She offers him divine union. But Gilgamesh rejects a goddess, and that is not done. Inanna unleashes her fury and sends the bull of heaven to punish Uruk. Chaos descends from the sky. The bull strikes the earth and splits it open. Fear returns to the city. But Gilgamesh and Enkidu fight again, and again they prevail. They kill the bull of heaven. Enkidu, triumphant, makes the final mistake. He mocks the goddess, and in that instant, fate is sealed. The gods could not allow it, because if humans begin to win, the cosmic order breaks. So they pass judgment. One of the two must die. And they chose Enkidu.
Not like a defeated hero, but like every human before death, vulnerable, confused, afraid, and Gilgamesh, the invincible king, the slayer of monsters, could do nothing. He watched him fade, day after day, until Enkidu died. And then, for the first time, Gilgamesh understood something no throne can conceal. Death does not respect crowns. The hero wept like a child. He clung to his friend's body. He refused to let go. Because if Enkidu could die, then so could Gilgamesh. And that thought shattered him. Here, the story changes tone. It ceases to be an epic of conquest and becomes an inner epic. Gilgamesh abandons Uruk, abandons power, abandons security, because now he no longer seeks glory. He seeks a way out, a way to escape the human condition. He seeks Utnapishtim, the man who, according to the tales, survived the great flood. The only one who received an unthinkable gift, eternal life. The journey is a nightmare, impassable mountains, total darkness, seas no one can cross, and still Gilgamesh continues because fear of death pushes harder than any army. At last he finds him, and Utnapishtim tells him the story of the flood, an ancient story. Terrible, familiar. The gods, angered by humanity, decide to wipe them out. One man receives warning. He builds a boat. He saves his family and the animals, and when the waters recede, the world begins again. Gilgamesh listens, fascinated, because if someone survived the end of the world, perhaps there is a door through which to escape death. But Utnapishtim does not offer him an easy path. He offers him a test. If you wish to conquer death, do not sleep. Gilgamesh sits. He tries. He concentrates. And within minutes, he falls asleep. Like any human being, as if the universe were mocking him. Immortality is not won by strength. It is not seized by ambition. In this story, immortality is a limit, a wall. And Gilgamesh strikes it, and it does not move. Still, Utnapishtim reveals one final secret. A plant at the bottom of the waters, a plant capable of restoring youth. Gilgamesh dives, he retrieves it, and for a moment he believes again. But on the journey back, when he stops to rest, a serpent steals it. He loses it, and with it, his final illusion. Gilgamesh returns to Uruk, but he is no longer the same. He does not return with immortality. He does not return with treasure. He returns with truth. He stands before the walls of his city. He contemplates them, and he understands something none of us wishes to accept, that what remains is not the body. It is what you build. It is what you leave behind. It is memory. Gilgamesh did not conquer death, but he conquered oblivion, because thousands of years later, we are still speaking his name. And while Gilgamesh returned to his city, Sumer continued to grow, but it also continued to tighten with tension, because cities do not produce culture alone. They produce rivalry, they produce wars, they produce empires. And the next chapter will not be about a hero, but about an entire system of gods, temples, and power.
In Sumer, the gods did not live in the sky. They lived in the city. Each urban center was a divine house, each temple a palace for invisible beings, and every citizen, in the end, worked to sustain that sacred order. Because here, religion was not an aspect of life, it was life. The gods had names, stories, rivalries. On, the primordial sky. Enlil, lord of wind and destiny. Enki, the intelligence of the deep waters. Inanna, desire, war, power. They were not distant gods. They were active forces, capricious, dangerous, and the city existed to appease them. The ziggurat was more than architecture. It was a staircase to the divine, a constant reminder that human order depended on something higher. But there was one crucial detail. Someone had to interpret the will of the gods. Someone had to administer rituals, offerings, festivals. And so, at the heart of Sumerian power, a silent elite rose, the priests. They managed the temple. They distributed grain. They organized labor. They decided what was divine will and what was not. In Sumer, politics and religion were the same thing. And within that system, the king did not rule by the sword alone. He ruled by divine permission. The gods chose me. That phrase, simple, powerful, became the root of almost every monarchy that followed in history. But when power is justified by the gods, it also becomes absolute. And where power is absolute, war emerges as destiny. There was a moment in history when memories stopped depending on the voice. Until then, everything lived in the air. Agreements were remembered. Debts were entrusted to one's word. Myths traveled from mouth to mouth. But the cities grew. The temples accumulated grain. Exchanges multiplied. And human memory was no longer enough. At some point, in the damp land between the Tigris and the Euphrates, someone took a piece of fresh clay and pressed a mark into it. He was not seeking poetry. He was not seeking eternity. He simply wanted to count sacks of barley, to count sheep, to count rations. But without knowing it, he was changing the destiny of humanity. In the city of Uruk, around 3200 BC, the first tablets appear. They were not books, they were not stories, they were records. Small pictograms representing real objects: a head of cattle, a jar of oil, a field of grain. Over time, those drawings became simplified. They grew abstract. They turned into wedge-shaped marks. Cuneiform writing had been born, and with it something far greater: the ability to fix thought. Writing was not easy. One had to learn hundreds of signs, master the exact pressure of the stylus, memorize formulas, numbers, divine names. Thus were born the schools of scribes. Boys, almost always boys, spent years copying tablets, repeating lists, learning discipline. A scribe was not a simple official. He was guardian of information, administrator of the temple, intermediary between power and the people. In a society where almost no one could read, whoever mastered writing mastered reality, because what was written was truth. Writing made something revolutionary possible: to collect taxes with precision, to register property, to organize armies, to sign treaties. But it also allowed something more subtle. It allowed the construction of narrative. If the king won a battle, the scribe recorded it. If the king lost, it might not be recorded. The tablet did not merely preserve data, it preserved the official version. For the first time in history, power could outlive the ruler. The king died, the inscription remained, and thus propaganda was born. What is extraordinary is that writing did not remain confined to accounting. Over time, it began to capture stories, hymns to the gods, prayers, epic tales. The same world that had produced Gilgamesh could now fix his legend in clay. Memory no longer depended on human fragility. It became object. It became archive. It became civilization. But every advance carries consequences. Writing created new hierarchies. It separated those who knew from those who did not. It created bureaucracy. It created formal laws. It created contracts. Life ceased to be only custom. Now it could be regulated. And when rules are written, they can also be enforced. With writing, Sumer crossed a point of no return. Cities were no longer just settlements. They were systems. Systems that could plan, coordinate, expand. Trade stretched to distant regions. Alliances were documented. Disputes were formalized. And in that process, something inevitable began to grow: ambition between cities. Because when you can count resources, you can also compare them. And when you compare, you compete. Sumer had invented the city. It had invented the temple as a center of power. It had invented writing. It was now ready to invent something far more dangerous: organized warfare on a massive scale.
The Sumerian cities were not meant to live in peace. too much pride, too many gods of their own, too many walls marking territory. Uruk, Lagash, Umma, each with its temple, each with its king, each convinced it stood at the center of the world. And when two cities believe they are the center, war does not take long. At first, they were disputes over water, a diverted canal, a fertile field claimed by both sides, a contested border. But soon, war ceased to be an accident. It became strategy. Kings were no longer merely religious leaders, they were commanders. Armies began to organize, infantry with spears, shields aligned, compact formations. War was no longer chaos, it was discipline, it was planning, it was economics applied to conflict. Because maintaining an army required grain, it required metal, it required administration, and writing, that tool born to count barley, was now counting soldiers. In this landscape, a different figure emerged, not satisfied with ruling his own city, not satisfied with winning a single battle. Lugal-Zaggisi, a king who achieved the unthinkable, to unite much of Sumer under a single command. For the first time, multiple cities obeyed one ruler. It was a tremendous achievement, but fragile, because power based on conquest requires constant victory, and there is always someone more ambitious watching from the horizon. While the Sumerian cities fought among themselves, a different force was rising in the north. A man who did not come from the old Sumerian nobility. A man whose story begins almost like legend. They say he was set adrift in a basket upon a river. They say he was raised far from the throne. His name was Sargon. He did not inherit power, he took it. He defeated Lugal-Zaggisi. He entered the Sumerian cities, and he was not content merely to rule them. He reorganized them. What had once been a network of rival cities became something new, an empire. Sargon did not only conquer, he administered. He installed loyal governors. He imposed Akkadian language and culture alongside Sumerian. He built a structure that did not rely solely on religious prestige. For the first time, a vast territory answered to a single center of power. It was not a temporary alliance, it was permanent domination. And with it was born an idea that would shape the next millennia. Empire as a model, one ruler, many cities, a system that transcends cultural borders. Sumer was no longer only Sumerian, it was transforming. But every empire carries a paradox. The larger it becomes, the harder it is to sustain. Rebellions, droughts, internal conflicts. After Sargon's death, the empire began to waver, and when the center weakens, the periphery burns. External peoples took advantage of the instability, invasions, fragmentation. Sumer, which had invented the city, writing, and bureaucracy, was now facing its own limits. It may seem like this is a story of decline, but it is not, because even if empires change their names, ideas remain. Centralized administration, organized warfare, written propaganda, the divine legitimacy of the ruler, none of that disappeared. It was transmitted to Babylon, to Assyria, to Persia, and far beyond. Sumer ceased to exist as a political power, but its model became immortal. Up to this point, power had been imposed with armies, with temples, with divine proclamations. But there was a constant problem. If the king decided justice, who decided whether the king was just? Rules existed, customs guided, priests interpreted, but everything depended on memory, and memory can bend. Then something decisive happened. Law ceased to be mere tradition. It became stone. In Babylon, centuries after the height of Sumer, a king understood the power of the written word. It was not enough to rule. The world had to be ordered. He ordered a series of clear, visible, permanent laws to be carved into a great black stone stele, not hidden in archives, not reserved for scribes, displayed, so that everyone would know the punishment, the limit, the price. It was a powerful declaration. Order does not depend on whim, it depends on rules. The laws were direct, at times brutal. If a man injured another, he would suffer the same injury. If a builder constructed a faulty house and it collapsed, he paid with his life. If a son struck his father, he lost his hand. It may seem extreme to us, but in its context, it was revolutionary, because it established proportionality, measured punishment, defined responsibility. It was no longer simple personal revenge, it was system. However, the law was not egalitarian in the modern sense. Society was divided. Nobles, freemen, slaves. The same crime carried different consequences depending on status. Justice protected the social order. It did not seek to transform it. And there lies the key. Law was not born to be compassionate. It was born to be stable. At the top of the stele, the king is shown receiving divine authority. He was not an autonomous legislator, he was an intermediary. The message was clear. Laws do not come from man alone, they come from heaven. And if the law is sacred, to disobey it is not merely a crime, it is a challenge to the order of the universe. What was truly transformative was not the severity, it was the permanence. The law could no longer be changed in secret. It could not be adjusted according to the ruler's mood. It was carved, visible, immutable. And that changed the relationship between rulers and the ruled. For the first time, authority had written limits. And though the king remained powerful, the text outlived him. Those laws were not perfect. They were not democratic. They were not gentle. But they established a principle that never disappeared. Power requires rules, and those rules can be recorded. From that moment on, every civilization would inherit that idea. Later empires would expand legal codes. Religions would create sacred laws. Nations would write constitutions. All of it has a common root, the decision to fix justice in something more solid than human memory.
No civilization feels the exact moment when it begins to fall. There is no alarm, no announcement, only small signs. Failed harvests, canals that deteriorate, isolated rebellions, borders growing ever more fragile. Sumer, which had been a pioneer in everything, began to show cracks. The agricultural system that had created wealth also had a limit. Constant irrigation over centuries left salt in the soil. Fertile land began to weaken, yields declined. More labor produced less food. And when food becomes scarce, every system trembles. Cities depended on a stable agricultural base. Without it, bureaucracy becomes heavy, the army expensive, the temple demanding. The balance slowly broke. Meanwhile, neighboring peoples were watching. The Amorites, the Elamites, other semi-nomadic groups. They did not bring the same urban tradition, but they brought mobility, flexibility, ambition. The proud and structured Sumerian cities did not always know how to adapt, and little by little, power changed hands. Sumer did not vanish in a single blow. It transformed. It was absorbed, reinterpreted. There was one final attempt to restore its greatness, the so-called Third Dynasty of Ur. A renaissance, strong administration, reforms, grand constructions. For a moment, it seemed the past could return, but history does not move backward. External pressures grew, internal crises deepened, and eventually Ur fell. Not with an epic explosion, but with the slow erosion of centuries. Politically, yes, the Sumerian language ceased to be spoken as an everyday tongue. Kings no longer called themselves Sumerian. The center of power shifted, but culturally, Sumer never died. Cuneiform writing continued to be used, myths continued to be copied, gods were adopted and adapted. Babylon inherited much of its structure. Assyria inherited its military and administrative model. Even ideas that would appear centuries later, flood narratives, divine laws, kings chosen by the gods, have deep roots in this ancient world. Sumer did not build the largest empire. It did not leave monuments as colossal as those of later civilizations. But it did something more decisive. It invented mental tools, the organized city, written administration, formal law, bureaucracy, epic narrative. It is difficult to imagine the modern world without those foundations: governments, contracts, taxes, archives. All of them cast an ancient shadow that begins on the plains between the Tigris and the Euphrates. When we speak of the first civilization, we are not speaking only of antiquity. We are speaking of an experiment, the experiment of living together on a large scale, of coordinating thousands of people, of organizing resources, of turning natural chaos into human order. Sumer was the first attempt, not perfect, not eternal, but decisive. And perhaps that is the most powerful lesson. Civilizations are not immortal, but ideas can be. And every time someone writes a law, administers a city, records a contract, or tells a story so it will not be forgotten, they are, without knowing it, repeating an ancient gesture. The gesture of that first scribe who pressed a wedge into clay and changed history forever.
Sumer fell. But the world did not return to silence, because when a civilization disappears, it does not leave a void. It leaves a legacy. The cities were still there. The temples were still standing. The tablets were still piled in archives. What changed was not the system. It was who controlled it. After the fall of the ancient Sumerian cities, a new power rose to prominence: Babylon. It did not emerge from nothing. It grew upon Sumerian foundations. It adopted cuneiform writing. It adapted the myths, it reorganized administration, but it added something of its own: stronger centralization, a more defined political identity. If Sumer had invented the model, Babylon refined it. The ancient stories did not die with Sumer. They were copied. They were reinterpreted. The story of the Great Flood continued to circulate. The epics were translated. The gods changed names, but not essence. Inanna became Ishtar. Enlil lost prominence to new deities. But the pattern remained. Heaven still ruled the earth. The king still received divine mandate. Humanity still searched for meaning in the face of chaos. Sumerian mythology became the narrative foundation of Mesopotamia. Further north, another force was rising: Assyria. It took the inherited organization and pushed it to a military extreme: professional armies, systematic strategy, uncompromising domination. The imperial model, begun centuries earlier, reached a brutal level of efficiency. But even that power had ancient roots: written administration, regional governors, organized tribute. All of it was inheritance. As empires expanded, ideas traveled with them. Merchants crossed regions, diplomats signed treaties, scribes copied ancient texts. Mesopotamia became a school for the ancient world. And those ideas did not remain there. They influenced the Levant, Anatolia, Persia. Even centuries later, many legal, religious, and administrative traditions retained Mesopotamian echoes. There is something unsettling in all this. Names change, borders change, capitals change, but the pattern remains. A city becomes powerful. It centralizes resources. It expands its influence. It faces internal tensions. It eventually falls, and another takes its place. Sumer inaugurated that cycle. Others perfected it. After observing this chain of inheritances, an inevitable question arises. If so many civilizations adopted the Sumerian model, how different is our world today? Centralized governments, written laws, bureaucracy, taxes, national narratives. We do not live in mud-brick cities with ziggurats dominating the horizon, but we still live within very ancient mental structures. Sumer was not only the beginning of written history, it was the beginning of a way of organizing reality. And in the next and final chapter, we will not speak of ruins, we will speak of us, because to understand the origin of civilization is to understand the present.
Imagine the scene: a humid plain, unpredictable rivers, small communities struggling to survive. Nothing seemed destined to change the world. And yet, there something began that still sustains us today. Sumer was not the largest civilization. It was not the longest lasting. It was not the most famous for monumental architecture. But it was the first to attempt something radical, to organize human life on a large scale. And that experiment never stopped. Today, we live in cities, millions of people coordinated by invisible systems. Taxes, records, infrastructure, laws. That began there, when the Sumerians decided that massive cooperation was possible, that natural chaos could be channeled, that collective labor could produce surplus. The city is not just a place, it is an idea, and that idea was born between the Tigris and the Euphrates. Every time you sign a contract, register property, or consult a digital archive, you are repeating an ancient gesture. the need to fix information, to no longer depend solely on memory, to turn thought into record. That first wedge pressed into clay is the direct ancestor of every modern document. The technology changed, the principle did not. Today's laws may be more complex, more extensive, more debated, but the fundamental idea remains the same. Power requires written rules. The ruler requires legitimacy. Society requires clear limits. That mental leap from custom to written norm was one of the greatest advances in human history, and it happened there. Even our deepest questions are not new. Is there life after death? Can human beings overcome their fate? Is there divine justice? Gilgamesh already asked those questions. The scribes already tried to answer them. The stories we now consider universal were already being shaped on tablets more than 4,000 years ago. We are not the first to doubt. We are heirs of an ancient conversation. Civilizations are born. They organize. They grow. They expand. They strain. They fall. The cycle did not end with Sumer, nor with Babylon, nor with Rome, nor with any later empire. History is not a straight line. It is a repetition of structures, ambitions, and limits. And to understand the first civilization is to understand the original blueprint. Sumer fell. Its temples eroded. Its language ceased to be spoken. Its cities were buried beneath sand. But its ideas survived. And that is the most powerful form of immortality. Not that of the body, not that of the empire, but that of influence. More than 5,000 years ago, someone looked at a flooding river and decided it could be tamed. Someone looked at a small group and decided it could become a city. Someone took clay and decided it could capture thought. That decision changed the world. And even though today we live among screens instead of tablets, among skyscrapers instead of ziggurats, we are still building upon that first foundation. We are heirs of clay. We are descendants of the first city. And every time we organize chaos, write a law, tell a story, or dream of leaving a mark, we are, without knowing it, continuing the experiment that began in Sumer.